Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Welcome to Let's Talk Tropics on a Friday. It is a lot calmer out in the tropics compared to what we've been dealing with for the past several weeks, but it doesn't mean that hurricane season is over. There is still plenty to watch that's out there. Fortunately, we don't have anything that's anywhere close to the Acadiana region, nor anywhere close to the Gulf Coast. Remember, the Gulf Coast so far this year has been hit by 5 hurricanes, and the record for 1 year is 6. Now 5 we've got a tie with a couple of other years, but 6 is the all-time record back in the I believe the 1880s. So it has been a very busy season locally, but overall we're still running pretty much close to an average season, at least at this point, but we still have about a month and a half to go before hurricane season is over. So we'll go ahead and get to what we've got going on right now. A lot of sunshine out there. It is very clear and very calm here in Acadiana. Beautiful day with temperatures there hovering around 82 degrees, dew point 57, humidity 43%, so that's pretty ideal right there. Winds are currently out of the east-northeast at 5 and the pressure fairly high there at 30.19. Gorgeous skies out there again today. Enjoy this fall-like air. I know it is a little bit warm during the day, and we're still expecting temperatures to hover in the upper 80s to near 90. Believe it or not, we're actually close to some records, or at least within 5 degrees. If we hit 89, I think the record high today is 94. So we're kind of in the ballpark of record highs, but us here in South Louisiana, when you have to go through brutal months like July, August, and September, when you get this dry air here, and even with temperatures around 90, it ends up feeling pretty nice. But a beautiful day here in Acadiana. And really, the rest of the nation is relatively quiet as well. Fortunately, things are quieting down over Florida. They've got a little cloud cover there over the central and southern part of the state. But with that slightly cooler and drier air coming in behind Hurricane Milton, that's providing those folks with a fairly decent day, because you know what it's like during recovery mode after a hurricane. Many folks don't have electricity, and a lot of times your hurricanes come through in August and September when it's that brutal heat. And even in October, when Lily came through back in '02 here in Louisiana, we still had about a week's worth of brutal heat before we finally were able to get a cold front to come through here. So for our friends in Florida, wishing them the best, of course, in the recovery effort, and hopefully we can continue to see some cooler, drier air kind of coming into Florida for the next couple of days to help out the folks that don't have electricity, that don't have the air conditioning, and maybe we can get that power back on a little easier, make it easier for the workers out there too that are putting everything back together. The remnants of Milton, though, are well off toward the east now, and it is a non-tropical low pressure area, but right in there, that is Bermuda. So it wants to give Bermuda a little bit of a kiss goodbye as it goes on off toward the east. So there are going to be some fairly rough seas and some gusty winds there on the southern side of Bermuda, but they will be seeing improving conditions and even some cooler temperatures there. If you look off the New England coast, those crystal clear blue skies that are coming off New England and the mid-Atlantic states, and then you get those kind of streaming clouds there, that is kind of an indication of some much colder air. And the New England states are going to be seeing some chilly stuff here going into next week, with even the possibility of the first snow, believe it or not, for parts of upper New England. But that cold front is going to be diving southward, and that's going to bring us some nice cool temperatures as we go into next week. And there's the latest on that power outage map there in Florida. They're down to about 2.3 million people still without power, but that's down a million from yesterday. So they are making some really good progress. It again, like I said yesterday, it's almost hard to believe that you don't have more counties here with 100% outages. And the fact that you're seeing this much improvement in such a short period of time in such a populated area that just got crushed by a Category 3 hurricane and moving all the way across the state, staying a hurricane into the Atlantic Ocean. It seems like they are rebounding when it comes to the electricity a lot faster than other areas have with past hurricanes over the course of this year. So let's wish them the best, and hopefully we can speed this up and everybody can get back on here as soon as possible. We also, believe it or not, still have Leslie that's spinning out in the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean. This is its 10th day in existence, so kind of a long-running tropical system out there in the Atlantic. The winds are down to 50 miles per hour as of the last advisory, and it is going to be kind of cruising off toward the northeast over the next several days. And we think over the weekend, it's finally going to become a non-tropical low pressure area, and we'll finally say goodbye to Leslie. And funny how, there's Leslie there, and you had other hurricanes and tropical systems that formed during that time that it was out there. And you talk about some of those longer running hurricanes. So in between so far, what we've seen is we've had Isaac, or let's say after Leslie, we had Milton out there. But for a while, we had Kirk that was kind of joining Leslie for a while. And if you remember Kirk, that was actually back into September. So Leslie's been hanging around for a while, but it's going to be fun to say goodbye to her here in the next day or two. Locally, things are now improving in the offshore waters here in the Gulf of Mexico too. So our friends that are out there working, I know you're having a beautiful day out there, and many folks are probably want to do some boating over the course of the weekend. It's going to be a pretty weekend with some comfortable temperatures. So it looks like our nearshore waters are finally going to see those seas running about 1 to 3 feet or even less, and then those winds are going to be light out of the east today at about 5 to 10 knots. So a really pretty day out in the offshore waters. And look at the satellite imagery, gorgeous all the way across the Gulf of Mexico. Fair skies for the most part, clear skies in many areas, and right off our Louisiana coast, we are in great shape with lots of clear skies. Now, I will say we could use some rain. We've only had a trace of rain so far this month. So it's been a while since we've had some decent rains. So I know there's a lot of folks that still have some gardens out there. You're trying to keep maybe some of your mums back up and running so before Halloween. But it's going to be working with the hose this time around for the next probably another week or so. Even another front coming through next week probably is not going to bring us a whole lot of relief. Central America, we've got some decent showers there on the Nicaraguan coast, and we've got some more showers that are pushing across the western part of the Caribbean. Fair skies over much of the Yucatan. Not much going on there, although we are going to be watching that Central American gyre. And if you're not familiar with that, I do have a description of that in that below in the description if you want to check that out. And it's really kind of a broad area of low pressure that kind of spins here across the Central American continent, and it runs there kind of across the Pacific and into the southern Gulf as well. And you get sometimes some disturbances that try to rotate around that. And Milton was one of those that kind of developed not just with the Central American gyre, but also an old tropical depression that came out of the Pacific there. And then Helene also was a part of that Central American gyre. You had a tropical wave coming in here, and then it kind of interacted with the gyre and then kind of moved on toward the north. So what that Central American gyre is just kind of a big low pressure area, and you get weak disturbances that kind of rotate around that. So right now it doesn't look too active, but it is something that we pay attention to during the early part of the hurricane season as well as the latter part of the hurricane season, particularly into October and November. Of course, the remainder of the Atlantic Ocean is relatively quiet, but believe it or not, even though we're about halfway through October, we are still seeing the possibility of some development there off the African coast near the Cape Verde Islands, and that particular wave now is considered Disturbance 94L, and that is the visible satellite there over the last couple of hours. It's located right there near the Cape Verde Islands, and there have been some reports of some wind gusts getting as high as tropical storm force there in some of the islands, so there's a possibility we could see some development there. And what's really a little more unusual about this particular disturbance is most of the time, if you're going to get something to develop that far out to sea during the month of October, they tend to generally turn a little bit more toward the north, kind of like what we saw with Leslie and what we saw with Kirk as well. But this one seems to want to track more in that traditional mid-hurricane season route across the Caribbean Sea and possibly heading over to the Leeward and Windward Islands. And we'll kind of look at that in some of the models in just a little bit. But the intensity, most of these are keeping this as a non-tropical low or maybe a weak tropical depression or tropical storm over the next 3 or 4 days. But this new model intensity guidance that just came down within the last hour or so is showing maybe going out day 6 and 7 that we could see some strengthening, possibly into a hurricane. So we'll keep an eye on that, but it's no threat right now. And it still can maintain over fairly warm waters, even though the eastern Atlantic is starting to cool down a little bit more. Most of the Atlantic basin can still support tropical systems with temperatures, water temperatures that are over 80 degrees. So the threshold on this particular map, since it's in Celsius, is 26.5. So basically everything that's yellow or brighter on this map is what can sustain a tropical system based on that 80-degree water. Also, looking ahead, we are looking at week 2 and week 3. This is more of a newer product that we've been using this year, and it's the Global Tropical Hazards Outlook. And it shows where there's the possibility of some development. It doesn't take into consideration anything that's already out there, but this is only for development zones. And we've been talking about computer models possibly bringing something in the western part of the Caribbean late next week, which of course would fall right there in that October 16th through the October 22nd period. And then it still seems to be a little bit more active here over the Western Caribbean going into week 3. Now, again, that is la-la land when you're getting out that far out, but some of those models might be seeing our Disturbance 94L out here that might have a chance of doing something in this particular area, but then it kind of fizzles in some of the models and then maybe starts to redevelop out here. So we're going to look at that in some of the models here in just a couple of minutes. But I want to focus more on the western part of the Caribbean, because this is where a lot of the tropical systems during the month of October tend to develop, and then they can be a threat to the southern part of the United States or the Gulf of Mexico or even the East Coast. But generally, they will work westward over Central America, or they'll curve back to the northeast, crossing Cuba and the Bahamas and heading out into the Atlantic Ocean. That's kind of the general movement. It's not always like that, but it does most of the time go that way. But remember, we had Hurricane Delta, which today is the anniversary of Hurricane Delta, and that developed more in the Bay of Campeche and shot right up toward us as a Category 1 hurricane. And then later on in the month, back in 2020, we had Hurricane Zeta that developed, and that crossed over the New Orleans area. So October hurricanes are not unheard of, and they're not unheard of in the second half of the month. So it's not yet time to let your guard down. But when we look at the GFS, I know I've been kind of talking here a long time, but you can see that it is trying to develop something going into next weekend. So about a week from today or a week from Saturday, you're seeing a low pressure area develop. And the GFS has been pretty consistent on developing something in this area about that time, about maybe 7, 8, 9 days from now. And there's been a lot of different solutions. This latest one that came down just a little while ago basically has it drift off toward the west over Central America and could be a significant storm there along the Honduran coast. And of course, that would, a lot of folks that were around back in the late 90s, Hurricane Mitch was a massive hurricane that moved there, and I'm almost positive it was an October hurricane as it moved westward, and it stalled over Honduras. And not only did you have these, I think it was a Category 5 for a while, but Category 5 winds, but then on top of that, it stalled over Central America and rained itself out, and it was just tremendous flooding and lots of loss of life in that particular area. So that is kind of what the GFS is suggesting, although I've seen some forecasts go this way, some forecasts go this way, some shoot it back out this way. I think yesterday or the day before there was one that was kind of coming a little closer to Louisiana. So we have consistency that something might develop according to the GFS, but it's very inconsistent on how strong and where a particular system would go. So the next thing we usually do is, and the GFS is the model that goes out the farthest. It goes out 16 days, but I'm just showing the 10 because after day 11, again, it's kind of like la la land, so it's really undependable. The Euro model, on the other hand, isn't really showing a low pressure area developing, but there's more of a concentration of moisture in this particular area as you start to go into next week. So again, we don't have anything to worry about for the weekend and really going into most of next week. If any development's going to happen down here, it's probably going to be going into next weekend, so over a week away. But I also wanted to point out, in these last few frames, not only are you seeing a lot of that tropical moisture kind of building here, but I want you to look in this direction. And remember, we talked about that disturbance kind of rolling off toward the east, or rather toward the west. Well, it shows up in some of these later frames going into the latter part of next week. You see that right there? So again, when you're talking about a more traditional route of a tropical system, if that is the case, that could affect areas of the northern Leeward Islands and possibly the Greater Antilles, which is Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and over toward Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, and into Cuba. So that is a possibility. So the Euro, even though not very robust on anything here, is kind of keeping disturbance 94L dragging its way off toward the west. And by the way, I believe if the next name on the list, I believe, is Nadine. And then if you got anything else that develops perhaps down in the Caribbean Sea, the following name after that is Oscar. And if you're a Gen Xer like me, Oscar sounds like a very scary name because of Oscar the Grouch that lived in the trash can. And as far as the Canadian model, it is a lot less robust on really anything, which is interesting because the Canadian model is the one that likes to develop stuff. It is indicating maybe that 94L kind of making its way westward across the Atlantic Ocean, but you're not really seeing a whole lot here going into next weekend. But again, if you look out here, there's that little bit of a low pressure area kind of drifting westward. It's a little bit farther to the south than what the Euro was predicting, but I've got two models now that are kind of working more with this out here rather than what might develop closer to home. And I will say at that time there's going to be a huge ridge of high pressure out here. So that generally should steer things off toward the west, anything that develops to our south or anything that's out in the Atlantic Ocean. But you also have to watch out for the possibility of that ridge kind of sliding off in that direction, which allows a little bit more of a return flow on the backside of that high. So again, all bets are off on this because it is just so far out into the future. The ICON model also is showing a little bit more development of tropical moisture in this area, but the ICON model only goes out 7 days. So again, this is going to be a little more inconclusive, but you can see there's kind of a broad area of low pressure that kind of tries to stir up there in the Western Caribbean off maybe the Nicaraguan and Honduran coast. And then also, if you kind of take a look out again out in the Atlantic Ocean, you'll start to see what we think is disturbance 94L, but it kind of rolls in and then kind of gets caught up in a trough that's here and more or less stays out in the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean with one of those more traditional October turns that would move off toward the northeast. So we've got a little bit of consistency between the four global models of maybe a broad area of low pressure or at least some additional moisture gathering in the western part of the Caribbean going into next weekend. The GFS is really the only thing that's producing an actual tropical system. And then, of course, we're going to have to watch 94L out to the east. So even though I'm saying that, right now it doesn't look like there's any kind of a threat at this point, this has been a very, very strange hurricane season, especially here as we've gotten into September and October, where it seems like the activity has really ramped up a lot. The La Nina period is still kind of trying to work its way in. We thought it was going to be on, holding pretty strong by July, which was expected to kind of amplify the latter part of the hurricane season. But even this La Nina isn't very strong. We're still kind of in that neutral zone right now between El Nino and La Nina. If it was going to be a stronger La Nina, and if it would have come in a little earlier, I think we would have seen some higher numbers. But so far, we've got 13 named storms in the book, and an average season is 14. We've still got about 6 to 7 weeks to go before hurricane season is over, so there's definitely a possibility that we're going to finish this above normal. Remember when I talked about that Central American gyre? Most of your October hurricanes tend to track in the Western Caribbean and then in the Western Atlantic near the Bahamas and Florida. Now, Unlike what I showed you with the global tropical hazards outlook, that only determines where development would be. This map shows where tracks would go. So you could have something that's already developed somewhere else, but they generally would track in those areas. But notice as we get into November, it's pretty selective on where all of our tropical systems go. Not only do we have less tropical systems by number overall, but we also tend to see them kind of pinpointing the far western the Caribbean and into the far western Atlantic around the Bahamas. A lot of times we don't have to worry too much about these storms. We've never had a hurricane hit land during the month of November here in Louisiana. But as I've said, this has been a very strange hurricane season, so kind of all bets are off. So we're not going to let our guard down until probably at least going into the early part of November this time around. So, just kind of keep track of stuff. And if you go down in the description below, there's a lot of different links that you can play around with, learn a little bit more about how things work, and you can kind of put your own forecast together there too. But of course, come back with me on Monday and we'll take a whole nother fresh look at all of this and see if there's any changes. You might remember last Friday when we left you, we really weren't seeing a whole lot, maybe a broad low pressure area over the western part of the Bay of Campeche. And by the time we came into Saturday, we had a tropical storm. And by Monday, we were looking at a Category 5 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. So things can ramp up very, very quickly. But right now, I think we're going to be okay as we go through the weekend. So enjoy your weekend. I know I will, not having to do every 3-hour updates on any tropical systems that are out there. So I hope you enjoy Let's Talk Tropics. I, of course, enjoy our midday chats here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on those notifications. And in between broadcasts, make sure you follow my social media pages there, both on Facebook and X. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.